So good morning.
Good morning.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you, Senator Harris, for both the privilege and the honor of being able to be here with you, the Honorable Senator Harris, and to hear the words and to know the work that it sounds like you not only spearheaded, but certainly had the opportunity to help build and guide and direct. And I told the senator right as we got ready to come together that I haven't read the report in full, but did peruse it a couple weeks ago, and thought, gosh, we're fighting the same things we were way back in '67. And I want to use that as framing for the remarks that I will make this morning. I was asked actually to make some remarks that would tee up what's going to happen around the whole health equity conversation, something certainly that we at Kaiser Permanente and many in health and healthcare are trying to figure out how we step into it. But I realize that it actually might be useful to provide some framing remarks that actually help us work alongside our work in addressing the inequities that exist in communities that have nothing to do with health. And one of the questions I had to ask myself was, are we working alongside communities? Are we working with communities? Are we working at the request of those communities? Or are we guests of those communities? And I think that those framings are super important. So let me just tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to bore you or shock you with the facts that we already know concerning inequity. And in fact, I felt like I was perfectly teed up. I owe you $5, Senator, because he actually did that beautifully. That's so the sobering facts that we know about health, about the income gaps, gender, equity, other sorts of gaps, education, housing, food, you name it, the inequities that exist not only in our country but across the globe. I'm also not going to describe programs that are working or work that's in progress, because first of all, that list is long and you all are doing a lot of that work yourselves. I'm also not going to make strident calls to action, because you are in this room because you're part of the ecosystem that's already driven to action. But what I am going to do is just sort of share some equity musings that I've had and actually have never given voice to in the way I think I'm going to do it today. And it's grounded in what I like to think of as the big question. And here's the big question. And again, it was beautifully laid out in the Kerner Commission report, and we had a chance to revisit that this morning. And here's the question: why might it seem, or in fact be, that we're always solving the same problems? Why might it seem, or in fact be, that we're always solving the same problems? So I want you to hold that question for a minute. And what I'm going to do, after simply defining equity, is unpack a picture, and I'll show you that picture in a bit. Don't bring it up quite yet, Sarah. I'm going to ask some wicked questions, and I think we all know that wicked questions are those ones that make us all a little bit uncomfortable. That all of us, I'm going to ask those questions of all of us that demand answers in this particular epoch in which we find ourselves. And I'm going to try and suggest that there are some more basic calls to action that the answers to those wicked questions might demand, of all of us in this room. I'm going to do this through the lens of asking for forgiveness, should I offend, instead of asking for permission. And I want you to know that I'm also going to have to forgive myself as well, because the answers to the wicked questions I want to pose to you, or to all of us, are mine to answer about myself as well. So you're probably wondering, what the heck is going on? Should I be afraid? Should I be concerned? Is this when I should run out of the room? And you know what? I know. Don't run. Don't be worried. I know we can more than hold the space for some of these questions. And I know it because we're up to the challenge. And we're also up to the look in the mirror that this very hard work demands. And you know what? It is good from time to time to make ourselves a little uncomfortable, to challenge our assumptions, to question our beliefs and our sense of things. And in part, it's because while we have chosen, in whatever way we do this, to commit our lives to our communities, to commit, whether at this time or at past times, that we've chosen to take on this work, we're still human. And the human condition, therefore, requires and demands of us that we take a little bit of time from time to time and just sort of, to be Dr. Allen-Davis for a minute, check your own pulse. Check your own pulse and see where you are. So to level set and not make assumptions about our understanding of equity, let me just lay out some simple working definitions, very simple. First of all, equity isn't equality, right? Equity equality implies sameness, and in terms of our work would imply that everyone gets the same level of everything, access to resources, to power, and all other manner of things. Addressing our issues through an equality lens would assume that, would assure that all that would do is assure perpetuation of the gaps, right? If we gave everybody the same thing, considering that we're not all starting from the same place. Equity also is an inclusiveness. Inclusiveness implies that we consider all people before creating new things, solving or approaching new problems or the ones that we're trying to do. That we consider and intentionally ask, who or what am I missing? Who's not in the room? And why might that matter? That's what inclusiveness is. Equity also isn't diversity. Diversity simply implies difference. I heard it put beautifully by a woman in the community who I used to have the pleasure of working alongside, Nita Mosby Tyler, who says, the room from a diversity perspective changes just by the introduction of a new person in the room. So all it is it's simply difference. And it is important in all of this work, and it does drive some of the problems, I should say the inequality thing. And essentially that is our inability to embrace difference in all of its dimensions as a strength, instead of the implicit and explicit ways we view difference as a liability. But equity, simply put, implies that every person has access to all that we need to realize our full potential. That's what equity is. We get all, and I actually go so far, in particular this is important in healthcare, all and only that which we need to realize our full potential. And therein lies the rub. So look, I don't want to turn this, I was thinking as I was writing my remarks, I said I don't want to turn this into an existential exploration of that rub, but I do want to unpack that picture of which I spoke. And so now, Sarah, if you would drum roll, put the picture up. I'm sure many of you have seen this picture, and I remember the first time that I saw it, I got it in an instant. It very beautifully lays out the difference between equality and inequality. And lays out in living color the whole notion that giving everybody the same simply continues to perpetuate the inequities that are there. But here's where I'm going to be incredibly vulnerable and hopefully not get kicked out of the room. But there have been some nagging questions that I think I'm ready to put into the room in search of answers that might drive some different outcomes. As I thought about it, I think about what is playing out are actually spoken and unspoken assumptions about how the world works and how we work within it. And that may be very useful in us doing some exploring, either at 2 in the morning when you're not sleeping, or in the sessions that you're going to have today, or in the work back wherever you do the work. And these things may be useful in addressing that big question. So here come the wicked questions. Whose problem is it that the boy is short? Right? Whose problem is it that the boy is short, the littler guy? Who says that that boy should have a taller box? Why is he entitled to a taller box? Why should the tall boy care that the shorter guy can't see the game? How does this inequity harm him? Does this inequity harm him? That is the tall guy. Whose responsibility is it to provide the taller box when you look over to the right and you see what an equity framework requires? What's the impact on those who can already see just fine of providing a taller box for the short child? You know, as I've thought about that one, I've thought, you know, it's interesting, we look at a number of problems in this sort of either or way of framing them, or in an abundance versus a scarcity mentality. You know, this whole notion that giving that child a taller box means that the child who can already see something is somehow or other taken away from him, as opposed to thinking about it through the lens that we got plenty. We have plenty in this world already in so many ways. And here's some that we've got to start to think about even more, even as we think about the ones that I already put out. Does simply providing a taller box really address the problem? Is the ground actually even? Is the ground even? Is the ground solid enough to hold that taller box, right? And as I thought about that question, I was really thinking about it through the lens of how we do a lot of our programming, where we'll bring a program in, as opposed to thinking about, as the Kerner report beautifully laid out, the systemic nature of structural and systemic nature of inequity, and the notion that we're going to give you this and somehow or other it's supposed to magically transform what's going on, as opposed to thinking about the ground upon which any of those boxes might be placed. And what about that wall? You know, I sort of looked back and thought, well, what about the wall? Why the heck is it even there? Wouldn't it be simpler just to remove the wall? And who determined the height of the wall, right? Who determined the height of the wall? You know, what are the sort of yardsticks we use, the reference ranges that we use to decide how to jump into this equity thing? So, anybody's head ready to explode? Yeah, because I ain't got no answers. I just had a lot of questions. I told Doug when I came to I don't have answers. Today it's all about the questions. So now then I went on to say, because as a woman who thinks too much, I think sometimes, let's pose a couple of different scenarios. What if the photo simply had the boxes and the children alongside them, and they knew this game was going on the other side? How would kids solve the riddle? How would children? What I want to think is they'd rush to the boxes with no thought of order. That's certainly one possibility. They'd just rush to it and jump on them. Maybe when the little one said, "I can't see," they'd figure out how to work it through. Or maybe they would innately go to the box that worked best with no thought of scarcity or abundance. Maybe that is, we get out of each other's ways and let these problems be solved, enable the problems to be solved on their own. And then I thought, well, how would adults solve the problem? Well, here's what I think they'd do. I'd want to think they'd do. I'd want to think they'd put the little guy on the big box and the taller guy on the smaller box and let the guy who doesn't need a box at all just kind of hang out. But I wonder, and maybe that's my tired, I will admit before this audience, 60-year-old cynicism coming out, because I'm not so sure that is, in fact, what would happen. What if the right size box were provided once the problem was realized? And we had to determine who gets access to the box. So this just sort of takes the questions even deeper. So we put the boxes, we provide that right size box, just as is on that one side where there's equity. And there we see to the side that there are a number of kids, and kids in this particular analogy or metaphor, I should have said, are proxies for communities, who are standing at the side. And those kids, by the way, were diverse. Do we make our decisions about who among the shorter kids can stand on the box based on our own implicit and explicit biases? And the reality is we do, right? We do. I mean, bias is part of the human condition. We are as tribal as we were the day that the first one stood up on two legs. And we do have them, and we know that we have them. And I don't say it to in any way invoke a sense of shame. It just, I mean, I'm pretty dispassionate about it. Bias is, and our responsibility is to at least know ourselves well enough to be able to, A, check in, again, check your pulse and know when those things might be playing out, and then address them. Address them in a way where you just have to say, I'll tell you a crazy story very quickly that I hadn't realized I was going to tell. So I spent 4 years on the Navajo reservation in Tuba City, Arizona. That's how I got medical school paid for. I was a National Health Service Corps scholar. Got a scholarship through them. And I remember one day getting a call from the emergency room where one of my patients, or a patient, had shown up and needed some help. And at the time, we were about to leave. So it was in 1992, and we were about to move here. My husband was already here. I had what did I have at the time? I guess I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and was trying to finish up getting the work done there in Tuba City and getting us moved here. And so this call comes, And I don't even remember what the actual case was, and it's kind of not important to the story. But I remember hanging up the phone and going, these people, blah, 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 blah. And I had myself one big out-of-body experience. I said, no, you didn't. Did you? That's how I say it today. Back then I went, these people? And I realized in that instant that when you're tired, and when you need to pee, and when you're hungry, and when you're distracted, you name it, those are those moments where you're most vulnerable, and some of those sort of hidden notions that you hadn't necessarily given voice to will come out. And it's your accountability and responsibility to sort of do exactly what I did and say, whoa, where did that come from? Stop it, stop it. That's victim blaming, as we well know, and it's actually your issue and not theirs. And so I think that whole notion of thinking about our implicit and explicit biases and how they're playing out is ours. It's a real accountability we have if we're going to have the time, the energy, the stamina to continue the work that we've got to do, that we've all committed to do on the part of communities. Here's another one. Do we adjust the sizes of the boxes, even though the challenges for the kids are the same? The kids are the same height, right? Or the communities have the same problems. But do we actually parse out the boxes in this case, that is the needs, in some very different ways based on all sorts of either structural, and it doesn't have to be personal, but certainly structural biases that we're not seeing. So I wish I had answers to give you, but I have had a few epiphanies just in terms of the thinking about this over the last few days in preparation for this. So I'm kind of excited to think about then what will this inform in terms of my own next path around my growth and development, but certainly I lay it at your feet as well to help us. So in the public health space, and how many do work in health equity in the room, by the way? So in the public health space, there's this metaphor we talk about, and there's this very sort of code language we use called going upstream. That is, we talk about going upstream, and in fact, we can talk about going upstream in education, and in food insecurity, in housing, in income inequality. It's all about going upstream. And the way the metaphor goes, it was actually a metaphor that took me a tiny bit of time to find, but I found some years ago that was written by a guy named Irving Zola, who was a medical sociologist. And the metaphor is that there's this guy standing at by the side of a stream, and he hears the cries of a drowning man. So he jumps into the water, he pulls the guy out, and he applies artificial respiration, and just as that person begins to breathe, he hears another cry for help, so he jumps back in. Swimming against this strong current, pulls the person out, repeats the same thing that I just said. And then, just as that person begins to breathe, he hears another cry for help. Now he's getting close to exhaustion, but he gets in, pulls the person out, the scenario plays out again. And just as that person begins to breathe, he hears yet again another cry for help. And as the metaphor ends, he says, near exhaustion, he finally takes a moment and looks upstream and asks the question, who's throwing him in? Who's throwing them in? So that's the upstream part. It's to go upstream and figure out in healthcare, because that's all we're doing. That's why it's $3 trillion. We're spending $3 trillion on activities, programs, processes, procedures, drugs, care, that actually has about a 10% impact on your overall health, as opposed to spending time on lifestyle and environment and income inequality and racism and violence and all the other sorts of things that we know are up there. So it's this notion of who's throwing them in and what are we going to do when we go upstream? Well, here's what I know about upstream, as you all well know, better than I. There's no doubt in my mind. It's messy up there. It's way messy up there, because that's when you do have to think about education. You do have to think about economic opportunity. We have to address our racism in all of the ways that it comes out. And in terms of the approach up there, it also can't be that education is trying to solve it independently of housing and urban development, of the Department of Human Services, independently of health and health care. That up there, we've all got to come together in a very different way and begin to think about these problems in an ecosystem. And that's because there's a professor from Harvard who wrote a book called, the book name went out. It'll come right back in a minute. But he talks about adaptive challenge. Leadership on the Line is the name of the book. And he talks about adaptive versus technical challenges. Technical challenges, simply put, are the ones that, the solutions are very easy to see. You got pneumonia, we figured out how to treat it, we treat it. We've got, so there are those very simple technical problems, or technical challenges. But adaptive challenges, so listen to this, are difficult to identify, but they're also easy to deny. They require changes in values, beliefs, roles, relationships, and approaches to work. The people with the problem do the work of solving it. They require change in lots of places, usually cross-organizational boundaries. And none of our organizations, certainly if we think about how our city, our municipal, our state, or our federal structures are set up, they're very, very siloed, and they fight over budgets. I know this, and so, as we all do. And in order to actually jump into these adaptive challenges, we've got to cross organizational barriers or boundaries, or both boundaries, barriers, which right away you can see all the cultural sorts of things that come up. At the heart of it, if you really look at the most bottom part of that bucket, what you'll find is that people either have an abundance or a scarcity mindset, and almost always it's scarcity. Those are my budgets. You don't get to spend in my budget. People often resist even acknowledging the adaptive challenge, and solutions require experiments and new discoveries, which means risk-taking, and they can take a long time to implement and cannot be implemented by edict. So what we do, and these are some of my epiphanies as I've been thinking about this work, is that we mix up, and we know this, we mix up technical and adaptive challenges, because we don't call it that, to use Heifetz's language, and we take technical approaches to adaptive problems, and we wonder why. Back to the big question. In some ways, we're continuing to have to solve them. What's another epiphany? We talk about this notion of working alongside communities and with communities, but we have to, but do we really look at ourselves as guests in those communities, as opposed to, pardon the pun, the great white hope who's sort of shown up and here I am ready to solve problems. We'll never say it that way, but it is worth our questioning and taking back, and in particular this is coming up, I think it's a real important question for funders to answer for themselves. That is, how high do we make the barrier, the hurdle for those community-based organizations who aren't as rich in assets as some of the larger foundations or corporations for that matter? How hard do we make it? That is, we make them come to us as opposed to what's our work to actually address the fees, the entry fees. And then the work challenges us, and it certainly challenges me daily. I've actually jokingly said, and there's some truth to it, to the extent that we believe in we get to recycle lives, the next life, I'm coming back as a philanthropist and I'm just writing checks, and I'm not going to make it hard. I am not going to make it hard for people who are doing work. And if I were a philanthropist this life, for you nonprofits in the room, I'd be giving you a whole lot more unrestricted income. Because you can't do your work when all we're doing, back to adaptive challenges, is thinking about this through the lens of programming. So we've got some work to do, I think, as those of us who are funders, to do it. So if we are to make significant impact while working on the structures, we got to work on ourselves. That's my point here. And so as I've thought about when we go upstream, this whole notion of going upstream, maybe some of the more basic work that we need to do is set aside programming and actually think about what are going to be the behavioral requirements of each of us doing this work that's different than how we're engaging in it now, that could actually result in a different outcome. I don't have the answers again to the thing, but I am starting to think about what would it look like differently. Part of the answer I'd say is that on reflection I've said from time to time over my life, I wish I had been born in the Star Trek time, because I like to think Star Trek is actually going to happen. And if you think about that, one of the things that they say is we come as explorers. We come as explorers. We come with a great sense of curiosity. We come with a sense of really understanding that communities, even though we talk about asset-based thinking, we actually deploy our work through a deficit lens. We come with this sort of sense of what's out there that not only can enrich and help us solve this problem, but that can help us solve problems in other places too. How do we serve as connectors of ideas and people? And finally, I think this notion of we have to explore our unconscious and the conscious ways that our biases show up in order to get out of our own way, let alone out of communities' ways, to sit really alongside and to be with them in terms of solving their problems. I want to end with a couple of quotes, and actually it may be a little bit longer quote, and it's actually from your fellow senator. So did we rehearse this or what? From Senator Robert Kennedy, and it was in a piece that I'm sure many of you all know, Marian Wright Edelman, who's just this amazing woman from who started the Children's Defense Fund. And she was writing about her friend Robert Kennedy and that whole time that you were speaking of. And one of the things that Kennedy said, and he was talking about violence, but he went on to say that there's another kind of violence, slower but just as deadly, destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference and inaction and slow decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that positions relations between men because their skin has different colors, poisons relations, between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books, and homes without heat in the winter. He went on to say, when you teach a man to hate and fear his brother, in all the ways that that shows up, I would add, subtle and not so subtle, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of the color of his skin or his beliefs or the policies he pursues, and that's why all the wicked questions come up for me. When you teach that those who differ from you threaten your freedom or your job or your family, that idea of giving a kid a bigger box means that somehow or other that other kid that it now has less, then you also learn to confront others not as fellow citizens but as enemies. Our lives on this planet are too short and the work to be done too great to let this spirit flourish any longer in our land. So the one question I do answer in terms of the wicked problems around why do we give anybody, why does this kid need a box? Because honestly, as you said, when one does better, we all do better. When one does better, we really did rehearse this. I just got chills thinking about that. This whole notion that as long as we continue to think that this notion of helping, enabling, supporting, helping people reach their full potential means that somebody else loses, guess what? Lose-lose is the game we're playing. Not win-lose, not lose-win, lose-lose. Senator Robert Kennedy ended, or this thesis piece that Marian Wright Edelman provided, said, each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And so I think our challenge over this, because you're right, we are absolutely living the old "may you live in difficult times" adage, or interesting times, I should say, and they're difficult, interesting times adage. I think in this particular epoch in which we find ourselves, and back to the big question, why is it that we still find ourselves solving the same damned problems, I'll say it, not blank, damned problems, I think our work, because if there's anything for sure we can control, it's how we step into this space, is to really think differently about how we position ourselves when we go upstream to help solve problems and work alongside, with, and as guests of community. So I'll end by thanking you, because I always tell my team, my 170 folks I have accountability for, you know I'm a gynecologist who's in charge of all of this stuff. I have learned so much from folks like you and maybe some who are sitting in this room around what is required to work respectfully in community. So I actually sit at your feet. I sit very much humbled and amazed and grateful for what you do back where you do it. And let's continue to do that work together and grow and learn ourselves. Thank you very much.